It is July of 1952, and Washington is hot. The air over the Capitol is heavy and still, the kind of summer night when the city seems to slow down and breathe. On the surface, everything is ordinary, but these are the early years of the Cold War, and beneath the calm runs a quiet current of fear. Fear of the bomb, fear of the Soviets, fear of the unknown. This is not a story that begins with a rumor or a blurry photograph. It begins inside a control tower, with the people trained to watch the sky, air traffic controllers, commercial pilots, Air Force officers, fighter jets sent up into the dark, and the careful records of a program called Project Blue Book. Over 2 weekends that July, something moved across the radar screens above the Capitol. The first weekend would have been strange enough on its own, but the case became much harder to set aside when the lights and the contacts came back 1 week later. We will walk through it slowly. The first blips on the screen, the witnesses who saw the lights with their own eyes, the investigation that arrived too late, the second wave, the press conference, the official answer, and the questions that answer never quite closed. So settle in, find a comfortable place, and let the day fall away. If you enjoy quiet case files like this one, consider subscribing so you do not miss the strange stories still to come. And now we begin in the control tower at Washington National Airport on the night of July 19th. The evening of July 19th, 1952, settled over Washington like a warm, damp blanket. It had been a long, hot day, and the night that followed was heavy and slow. At Washington National Airport, the work went on the way it always did. Planes came and went. Controllers spoke in their steady, clipped voices, reading the traffic, handing it off, bringing it down. For most of that night, there was nothing to mark it apart from any other shift. Inside the radar room, an air traffic controller named Edward Nugent sat at his scope, watching the soft green sweep of the screen. Most people called him Ed. He knew the sky over the Capitol the way a sailor knows a stretch of coast. He knew which lights belonged to which aircraft, where the traffic should be, and how it ought to move. Reading that screen was not guesswork for him. It was years of practice, settled into instinct. Then, just before midnight, something appeared that did not belong. 7 targets bloomed onto his screen at once, clustered together about 15 miles to the south and southwest of the Capitol. 7 solid returns, where there should have been none. No scheduled flights matched them. No pilot was calling in. They had not asked for permission to be there, and no one had cleared them through the airspace they were drifting into. They should not have been there. Ed Nugent watched the screen for a moment, the way anyone does when the familiar suddenly turns strange. This was not one faint blip that might be a flaw in the equipment. This was a group of them holding together, moving as a set across some of the most carefully watched airspace in the world. He called over his supervisor, a senior controller named Harry Barnes. Barnes was not a man who rattled easily. He looked at the cluster of returns, took in what they meant, and made the kind of dry joke a steady person makes before a situation has turned frightening. "Here's a fleet of flying saucers for you," he said, or something close to it. It was the sort of remark you offered to keep the room calm. But the joke did not change what the screen showed, and Barnes, for all his ease, understood within minutes that this was not ordinary traffic. It helps to pause here and think about what radar actually is, because the whole story rests on it. Radar is, at heart, a simple idea. A station sends out a pulse of radio energy into the sky. when that pulse strikes something solid, an aircraft, a flock of birds, a wall of weather, part of it bounces back. The radar catches that echo and paints it on the screen as a small, bright shape. The operator watches those shapes move and learns to read them. A passenger plane makes a steady, predictable track. It travels in a straight line at a sensible speed in the direction a plane should go. The 7 contacts over Washington did not move like that. They drifted and shifted in ways that did not fit the smooth, orderly paths of commercial traffic. At times, they seemed to hang in place. At other times, they slid across the scope with a speed that ordinary aircraft of the day could not manage. They behaved less like a flight of airliners, and more like something with no flight plan and no rules to follow. For a room full of trained men, this left only a short list of explanations, and not one of them was comforting. Perhaps the radar itself was wrong. Fooled by some trick of the warm summer air, perhaps these were aircraft that simply had not announced themselves. Or perhaps, and this was the thought no one wanted to say out loud first, they were something else entirely. And in the summer of 1952, that last thought carried a particular weight. This was the early nuclear age. The Soviet Union had tested its own atomic bomb only 3 years before, and the fear of a surprise attack was not a plot in a film. It was a national worry, built into the plans of every defense officer in the country. The skies over the capital were not just busy airspace. They were a doorway to the heart of American power, to the White House, to the Capitol, to the Pentagon itself. If unknown objects could gather over that ground, unseen and uninvited, then someone needed to know what they were, and quickly. The possibility that hung in the room was not a little green creature. It was the cold idea of an enemy aircraft slipping in where it should never have reached. So, this was no longer a single strange light, glimpsed by one person on a country road and easy to wave away. This was a cluster of solid contacts, tracked on professional equipment by professional men, unfolding in real time over the most sensitive airspace in the nation. It could not be filed under imagination. It could not be filed under a tired man seeing things. It was there, on the screen, in front of several pairs of trained eyes, and it would not go away. The radar room had become very quiet. For a while, the contacts were only that, shapes on a screen, a problem of returns and echoes and instruments. But that was about to change. Soon the men in that tower would no longer be reading the story secondhand, painted in green light on glass. Soon they would step toward the windows, look out into the dark sky over Washington, and begin to see the lights for themselves, while the radar room held its breath over those 7 contacts. The strangeness was spreading to other parts of the tower. Up in the glass lookout, where the controllers watched the runways and the sky with their own eyes, a man named Joe Zaccaro was working his own equipment. He too had picked up an unidentified contact, a return that matched nothing he expected to see. So, he did what any careful person does. He looked up, he went to the window, and searched the dark sky for whatever the instruments were insisting was there, and he found it. A single bright light hung in the air over the Capitol, not blinking, not flashing in the pattern of an aircraft's navigation lamps, just a steady, solid glow, holding still against the night. Zaccaro watched it for a moment, then turned to a colleague in the tower, a man named Howard Coughlin, and said the thing that was already forming in everyone's mind. "If you believe in flying saucers," he told him, "that could be one for sure." It was half a joke and half a confession. But while they watched, the light did something no balloon and no star could do. It held its place, and then it shot away at a speed that left no doubt it was under some kind of control. One moment it was there, the next it was simply gone. That was the moment the case changed shape. Until then, the contacts had lived only on the radar, green shapes that a skeptic could blame on the machine. Now, a trained controller had seen one with his own eyes. He would not be the last. Around the same stretch of hours, an Air Force controller named William Brady reported a sighting of his own. What he described was different from Zacharow's steady glow. Brady saw an orange ball of light trailing what looked like fire, sliding across the sky in a way he could not place. It did not match a plane he knew. It did not match anything familiar to a man who spent his working life watching aircraft. And that is why Brady matters in this story. He was not a farmer startled by a light over a field, or a driver who glanced up from a lonely road. He was trained to read the sky through a military lens, to tell an airliner from a fighter, a landing light from a flare. When a man like that says he saw something he could not name, the words carry a different weight. By now, the orange lights over Washington were becoming the signature of the night, and the tower decided to test what they were seeing against another set of eyes that were already up in the sky. Out on the field, a Capital Air flight was preparing to leave. Capital Air Flight 807, bound for Detroit, lifted off from Washington National and climbed into the warm dark. The control tower reached out to its pilot, a man named S.C. Pierman, and asked him to keep watch and report anything unusual he might see from the cockpit. He did not have to wait long. Pierman caught sight of an orange light ahead of him and called it in. "There's one," he said, "and there it goes." From the cockpit, he had the clearest view of anyone that night. Nothing between him and the open sky. Over the next stretch of his flight, he watched not one light, but 6 bright points moving across the dark like falling stars, except that falling stars leave a tail and burn out in an instant. And these did neither. They were steady, they were lit, and they kept their shape for about 14 minutes, far longer than any meteor, far longer than any easy explanation. Radar was no longer alone. That is the heart of what made this night so hard to set aside. It was not one kind of evidence standing by itself. It was layer upon layer, all stacked on the same few hours, all over the same restricted patch of sky. Solid radar contacts in the room below, a steady light seen by a tower controller, an orange fire-trailing object reported by an Air Force man, 6 lights tracked from a cockpit for a quarter of an hour by a working pilot. Each account on its own might be argued away as nerves or weather or a trick of the eye. Together, on a single night, in a single place, they were something else. Back in the tower, Harry Barnes was no longer reaching for dry jokes. He had watched the radar, heard the visual reports come in one after another, and understood what they now added up to. This was not a curiosity to note in a logbook and forget. Unknown objects were moving over the heart of the country, near the seat of its government, and no one could say what they were or who controlled them. That made it more than a strange night. It made it a matter of national security, and once a situation crosses that line, the response is no longer a phone call and a note in a record. It becomes a decision made higher up the chain, in rooms where the question is not what is it, but what do we send to meet it. By the small hours of the night, the men in the tower had done all they could from the ground. They had tracked the contacts, confirmed them by eye, and matched them against every aircraft that should have been in the sky. Nothing fit, with unknown objects drifting over restricted airspace, close to the White House and the buildings around it, Harry Barnes followed the only protocol that made sense. He picked up the phone and called the military. What happened next should have been simple. The Capitol sat under some of the most defended sky in the world. When unknown aircraft appear over that ground, fighters go up to meet them. That is the entire point of an air defense. But the night had a small, almost absurd problem waiting. The closest field to Washington was Andrews Air Force Base. On paper, Andrews was the natural place to launch from. Its jets could be over the Capitol within minutes. Yet on that night, Andrews could not send anything up. Its runways were closed for repairs. The base built to help guard the Capitol sky was, for the moment, grounded. So the call went further out. The interceptors would come from Newcastle Air Force Base across the line in Delaware, about 160 kilometers from the city. The aircraft sent were F-94 jets, fast and modern fighters, built for exactly this kind of work: to climb hard, close the distance, and identify whatever was up there. It took time for them to arrive, and time in this story mattered. When the jets finally reached the skies over Washington, the pilots looked and found nothing. No orange lights, no fire-trailing objects, no steady glow holding against the dark. The sky ahead of them was empty, and on the screens back in the tower, the same thing was happening. As the interceptors came in, the contacts thinned and faded, slipping off the radar like breath off cold glass. The pilots searched. They saw clear sky, low on fuel, and with nothing to chase, they were eventually ordered to turn back toward base. And that is when it happened. As the jets left the area, the contacts returned to the screens. The blips reappeared, drifting again over the same airspace, as if they had only been waiting for the room to empty. Then they came back. It happened more than once. The jets would arrive, and the sky would clear. The jets would leave, and the objects would return. To the men watching the radar, it began to feel less like a chase, and more like a strange, silent exchange. The targets answering the response with a quiet response of their own. It is worth being careful here. A pattern like that can be read in more than one way. Perhaps the jets simply missed objects that were always faint and hard to see. Perhaps the warm air over the city was doing something to the radar that changed when aircraft moved through it. None of that can be ruled out, but it is also true that some of the witnesses that night, and some of the people who studied the case later, could not shake the feeling that the timing looked deliberate, as if whatever was up there knew when it was being watched and when it was not. The story does not need to decide that. It only needs to report what the men in the tower felt as the night wore on. They were not chasing a single light anymore. They were caught in a rhythm they did not control, ordering jets up into an empty sky, then watching the contacts return the moment the jets turned for home. By the time the sun began to rise, it ended the way it had begun. Quietly, the lights faded, the radar cleared, and the sky over Washington went back to being an ordinary summer dawn, pale and washed out and empty, as if nothing at all had moved across it in the night. But something had, and the men who had spent those hours watching it knew that no single bad instrument, no one tired operator could account for everything they had tracked. Radar and eyes, the room and the cockpit, the military and the tower. Too many threads, all pointing at the same handful of hours over the same patch of restricted sky. By morning, the story was no longer contained inside the airport. Reporters had begun to ask questions. The word was spreading that something had happened over the Capitol, something involving radar and jets and lights no one could name. The government would soon need an answer, and answers in matters like this were supposed to come from one particular place, a small Air Force program built for exactly this kind of mystery. The strange part was that the man who ran that program had not yet been told any of it. To understand why that quiet morning mattered so much, we have to step away from the tower for a while. The strange lights over Washington did not fall into an empty world. By the summer of 1952, the United States Air Force had already spent years wrestling with reports of unexplained things in the sky. This was not a brand new problem. It had a history, and that history had names. It began in earnest after 1947, the year a wave of sightings swept across the country, and the phrase flying saucer entered everyday speech. In response, the Air Force opened a study called Project Sign, the first official attempt to take these reports seriously and decide what they were. Project Sign gave way to a second effort called Project Grudge, which ran from 1948 to 1951. The name fit the mood. By then, much of the official attitude had hardened into something closer to annoyance than curiosity, a wish that the whole subject would simply go away. It did not go away, and so, in 1952, the work was reborn under a new name, the one that would become the most famous of them all, Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book was the Air Force's program for the study of unidentified flying objects, what most people simply called UFOs. It was based at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, far from the capital, deep in the world of military intelligence and engineering. And the man placed at the center of it was younger than most people might expect. His name was Captain Edward J. Ruppelt. He was 29 years old. Ruppelt was not a dreamer or a believer chasing lights. He was a veteran of the Army Air Force, a man who had flown in combat in the Second World War. He held a degree in aeronautical engineering, the science of how aircraft are built and how they fly, and he worked within the Air Technical Intelligence Service, the part of the Air Force whose job was to study foreign aircraft and new threats. He was, in short, exactly the kind of careful, technical mind you would want looking at a problem this strange. The job he inherited was enormous. Thousands of reports had piled up over the years, and they did not sort themselves neatly. Some were honest mistakes, a bright planet, a weather balloon, a reflection on a canopy. Some were hoaxes made up for attention. Some were impossible to explain at all. And buried among them was the possibility every defense officer feared most, that a few might be real aircraft built by an enemy testing American skies. Ruppelt's task was to pull these apart, case by case, and decide which was which. And here, the story takes a turn that is hard to forget. Not long before the Washington events, Ruppelt was reportedly approached by a scientist from a government agency that has never been named. The man had a warning. Within the next few days, he said, "You're going to have the granddaddy of all UFO sightings in Washington or New York." It is the kind of line that invites every dramatic conclusion, but it is worth holding it gently. We do not know the scientist's reasoning, or whether it was a careful prediction, a lucky hunch, or simple coincidence that happened to land near the truth. There is no proof of secret foreknowledge, and no need to reach for a conspiracy to feel the weight of it. The warning came. Days later, the lights came. The space between those two facts is exactly where this case likes to live. Now hold that warning in mind and set it beside what actually happened on the night of July 19th. The most important UFO investigation in the country was based at Wright-Patterson. Its head was a trained intelligence officer who had just been told in so many words to expect a major event over Washington. And when that event arrived, when the radar lit up and the jets scrambled and the lights moved over the Capitol, Edward Ruppelt was not called. He was not alerted. He did not learn about the most dramatic UFO night in years from a military channel or an urgent phone call or his own program. He learned about it from the newspapers. The investigator had not been told. When Ruppelt did finally reach Washington a few days later, he tried to do his job the way he always did, carefully and on the ground, by talking to the people who had been there. He wanted to interview the air traffic controllers, the men who had watched the contacts with their own eyes and tracked them on their own screens. It should have been straightforward. It was not. What followed reads less like a thriller and more like a tangle of paperwork. He could not get a staff car to drive him where he needed to go. He could not get approval for a rental car either. And when he looked at taking a taxi, the cost was more than his daily allowance. His per diem would cover. A captain leading the nation's UFO program, standing in the Capitol after the biggest sighting wave in years, could not find a way to get across town to interview the witnesses. His frustration was real, and he did not hide it. If flying saucers were buzzing Pennsylvania Avenue, he said, he had reached the point where he couldn't care less. It was the bitter humor of a man who had been handed an extraordinary case and then blocked at every small step from actually working it. So Ruppelt left Washington with far less than he should have had. The trail had cooled. The witnesses were scattered. The official investigation into the strangest night of the year had been hobbled by closed runways, missed calls, and a denied taxi fare. What he could not have known was that the case was not finished with him, that the lights were not done with Washington, that in exactly 1 week, the screens would fill again, the jets would fly again, and this time the man in charge would not have to read about it in the morning paper. For 1 week, Washington was quiet again. The radar screens behaved. The dawn skies stayed empty. Whatever had moved over the Capitol on the night of July 19th seemed to have moved on, and the story began to settle into the past, the way strange stories often do. Then, on the night of July 26th, exactly 1 week later, it came back. The unexplained lights returned to the skies over the Capitol. The contacts returned to the radar. And this time, the man who ran the country's UFO program would not learn about it from a newspaper. It started with a phone call. Around 10 o'clock that evening, Edward Ruppelt's phone rang. On the line was a journalist from Washington, and the question was blunt. The lights were back over the Capitol. What, the reporter wanted to know, was the Air Force going to do about it? Ruppelt did what any officer in his position would do. He called the Pentagon to find out what was already underway, and what he found was almost as troubling as the sightings themselves. Once again, the response seemed slow, scattered, uncertain. A week after the first wave, with the press already circling, it was not clear that anyone was firmly in charge of the situation on the ground. This time, at least, Ruppelt could act. He sent 2 men he trusted straight into the heart of it, to Washington National Airport, to see the thing with their own eyes. The first was Major Dewey Fournet, an officer closely tied to the Air Force's UFO work. The second was a radar specialist, Lieutenant Holcomb, a man who understood exactly what those green screens could and could not do. and who could tell the difference between a real target and a trick of the equipment. What they walked into was worse than the week before. The controllers were tracking about a dozen unexplained contacts, not 7 this time. A dozen! Almost double the number from the first weekend, scattered and shifting across the same restricted airspace. The room held the same low, focused tension it had carried 7 nights earlier. Except now, the people in it knew this was not a one-time fluke. It had happened before. It was happening again. The targets did not behave like ordinary aircraft. They appeared to move together in a slow, curving arc, a low-speed formation drifting across the sky, in a way no flight of airliners would fly. And the contacts were not confined to one screen, in one building, where a single faulty machine might take the blame. Andrews Air Force Base, watching the sky on its own separate radar, was seeing the same thing. The same number of objects, in the same places. 2 sets of equipment, in 2 locations, painting the same picture of the same impossible traffic. And as before, the radar was not working alone. Commercial pilots in the area again reported glowing lights in the night sky, the visual half of the story joining the electronic half, just as it had a week earlier. 2 kinds of evidence, gathered by different people, pointing at the same place, at the same time. Then came one of the strangest moments of the second weekend. An Air Force B-25 happened to be passing through the area, and Fournette seized the chance. He asked the crew to fly toward the spot where the radar showed the contacts, and to report what they could see with their own eyes. It was the cleanest test anyone could ask for. The screen said something was there. Now, an aircraft would fly straight at it and look. The B-25 went where it was told. The crew searched the sky over the location the radar had marked, and they saw nothing. Nothing strange, nothing glowing, nothing out of place. The only thing they could make out below them on the dark water was a tourist boat drifting along the Potomac. Here, the case folds back on itself in a way that has never been fully resolved. To the crew of that bomber flying through the very airspace in question, the sky was empty. To the radar operators on the ground, watching their screens at that same moment, the sky was not empty at all. The contacts were still there, more than one station, in more than one place, still showed something moving where the bomber found only night air and a quiet river. The men in the air and the men on the ground were looking at the same patch of sky, and they did not agree on what was in it. Both accounts were reported as true. The plane saw nothing. The radar saw something, and no one on that night could close the gap between them. It would have been easy after the first weekend to file the whole affair away as a single, confusing night, a knot of nerves and warm air and bad luck that would never repeat. The second weekend took that comfort away. The same airspace, the same kind of contacts, now in greater numbers, the same pairing of radar and human eyes, the same jets, soon to climb again into the dark. What had looked like a strange accident was beginning to look like a pattern. And a pattern is far harder to explain away than an accident. By the early hours of July 27th, the capital had lived through its second strange night in 8 days. The contacts would fade again before morning, the way they always did. But the country was no longer going to let this pass quietly. Too many people had seen too much, on too many screens, for too many hours. An answer was coming. It would be calm and confident, and it would point not at the sky, but at the weather. When the experts looked for a way to explain the 2 strange weekends over Washington, one phrase rose above all the others: temperature inversion. In time, it would become the official public answer, the explanation printed in newspapers and repeated for decades. To understand the case, you have to understand this idea, and you have to give it a fair hearing, because it is not a foolish one. The idea works like this. Normally, the air grows cooler as you climb higher into the sky. But sometimes that order flips. A layer of warm air settles on top of a layer of cooler air below it, like oil resting on water. This is called a temperature inversion. And where those two layers meet, something happens to signals that pass through them. A radar pulse traveling out from the ground can bend as it crosses that boundary. Instead of going straight, it curves. When that happens, the radar can be fooled. A signal that should have passed harmlessly into the open sky can bend downward, strike something solid on the ground, a building, a hill, a distant structure, and bounce back. The operator, reading the screen, sees a return, but the return does not appear where the real object sits. It appears displaced, painted onto the glass, as if something were hanging in the air, when in truth it is only an echo of the ground bent by the warm layer above. Now here is why this explanation deserves real respect. Washington, during that stretch of July 1952, was reportedly going through repeated temperature inversions. The very conditions for this kind of radar trickery were present in the sky over the Capitol, and radar operators were not strangers to the effect. They knew that inversions could throw false returns onto a screen. This was a known problem in a place where the problem was actually occurring, observed by people who understood it. That is not a weak argument. It is a serious one. It is also true, more broadly, that radar anomalies are not rare. A screen full of bright shapes does not prove a sky full of craft, weather fronts, flocks of birds, distant ground clutter. All of it can paint the glass with returns that mean nothing. Any honest look at the Washington case has to begin by admitting a simple fact. Radar, on its own, can lie. A clean answer, not a complete one. Because the moment you set the explanation down beside the people who are actually in the room, it begins to strain. Lieutenant Holcomb was a radar specialist. Reading screens and knowing their tricks was his whole profession. Major Dewey Fournay was there beside him. The tower controllers had years of experience between them. These were not nervous beginners meeting a temperature inversion for the first time and mistaking it for a fleet of saucers. They knew what inversion clutter looked like on a scope. And when they studied these contacts, they did not believe they were looking at false echoes bent off the ground. They believed they were tracking real, solid objects moving through the air under their own power. That is the heart of the tension. The explanation says the men were fooled. The men, including the one specialist whose entire job was not to be fooled by exactly this effect, said they were not. And then there were the jets. Around 11 o'clock on the night of the second weekend, the F-94 interceptors were scrambled once more, climbing toward the contacts the radar still showed, and the now familiar thing happened. As the jets reached the area, the contacts faded from the screens. The sky emptied ahead of the pilots, just as it had a week before. But this time, there was a detail that does not sit easily with the weather explanation. One of the interceptors reportedly managed, for a brief moment, to gain its own airborne radar lock on a target. Not a ground station bending a beam off a building. A fighter's own radar up in the sky, holding a contact in front of it, before the lock slipped away and the target was gone. A temperature inversion near the ground is one thing. A lock acquired by an aircraft already in the air is much harder to fold into the same tidy story. And when the jets ran low on fuel and turned back toward base, the contacts did what they had done before. They drifted back onto the screens, returning to the same airspace the moment the sky was clear of fighters. The same rhythm as the first weekend. Arrive, and the sky is empty. Leave, and the objects return. This is where the temperature inversion explanation reaches its limit. It can account for some of what the radar showed. On a warm, layered night over a city full of inversions, false returns are entirely plausible, and an honest investigator has to weigh them seriously. But the explanation struggles with the rest of the case. It does not easily explain why trained specialists who knew the effect by heart rejected it. It does not explain the visual sightings, the lights seen by pilots and controllers with their own eyes, and it does not explain the timing, that strange, repeated rhythm of objects that seem to wait for the jets to leave before coming back. Warm air does not keep watch. Warm air does not know when a fighter has run low on fuel. Yet the contacts, again and again, behaved as if they did. The weather could explain the screen. It could not quite explain the pattern. And that gap between a clean official answer and the full, strange shape of what happened is the gap the whole case lives inside. If you are still with us, settle back in. We have come a long way from those first blips on the screen, through 2 strange weekends, and into the official answer that tried to close the case. If you find calm comfort in stories like this one, you might like the video and subscribe so the next case file finds you when it is ready. And if you feel like it, leave a quiet comment with what feels most convincing to you so far. The weather, a secret aircraft, something foreign, or something still unknown. There's no need to decide tonight. What comes next leaves the explanations behind and follows a single pilot who tried to chase the lights. It was just after 1 o'clock in the morning when the night reached its sharpest edge. For hours, the controllers and officers at Washington National had been living inside the same impossible loop. Contacts on the screens, jets sent up, contacts gone, jets back, contacts returned. The room was tired and tense, running on coffee and nerves, and still the blips drifted across the glass, refusing to be named. So the order came once more: scramble the interceptors, send the fighters up again. But this time, the hope was different, sharper. Maybe, if the timing was right, the pilots would finally close the gap. Maybe this time, a man in a cockpit would see with his own eyes the thing the radar kept insisting was there. One of the pilots who climbed into the dark that night was named William Patterson. He flew an F-94, a fast interceptor, an aircraft built for a single purpose: to catch other planes and force them to be identified. His encounter would become one of the most quoted moments of the entire Washington case. Patterson took his fighter up over the Capitol, and this time he saw them. Lights in the sky ahead of him. Not a smears on a radar screen. Not a report relayed up from the ground, but lights glowing in the night air in front of his canopy. After hours of objects that vanished the moment a jet drew near, here at last was something a pilot could chase. So he chased it. He pushed his interceptor toward the lights, trying to close the distance to pull near enough to see a shape, a structure, anything that would turn a glow into an identified object. This was exactly what the aircraft was built to do. It was exactly what he had been trained for, year after year, was to run down a target and pin it down, but the lights would not be caught. Whatever Patterson pursued, it stayed ahead of him. As he closed in, it seemed to draw away, holding its distance, slipping out of reach. He had speed, training, and an aircraft designed for the chase, and none of it was enough. One of the Air Force's fast modern fighters, flown by a capable military pilot, could not force the issue. He could see the lights. He simply could not catch them. And eventually, with the gap refusing to close and his fuel a growing concern, William Patterson did the only thing left to do. He broke off, gave up the chase, and turned back toward base. The sky had won. It is worth slowing down here, because this is a moment that gets pulled in dramatic directions, and it does not need to be. We do not know what those lights were, and nothing about this proves a craft from another world, or technology beyond human hands. There are quieter possibilities, and they should not be waved away. But set all of that aside, and a hard fact still remains. On a single night, over the capital of the country, a military interceptor pilot tried to pursue something in the sky, and the something outran him. That alone is a serious event. Trained pilots and frontline fighters do not casually fail to catch what they are sent up to catch, whatever it was. It moved in a way that left one of the nation's air defenders empty-handed over his own capital. Watching lights he could neither reach nor name. And then, as the first weekend had ended, so did the second. The hours wore toward dawn. One by one, the lights faded. The contacts thinned and dropped from the screens. By the time the sky began to pale in the east, there was nothing left to chase. No glow over the city. No cluster of blips on the glass. Only the ordinary gray of an early summer morning settling over Washington, the rooftops, and the river Sachin emerging quietly into the light, as if the whole long night had never happened. But it had happened, and this time, the people who had lived through it understood that the consequences would not stay inside the tower walls. By the time that morning came, the Air Force did not have one problem. It had two. The first was the one it had been wrestling with for years, the genuine, unsolved question of what these objects actually were. The second was newer, and in its own way, just as pressing. The story was out. Reporters had spent 2 weekends watching radar operators, jet scrambles, and lights over the Capitol. The public was about to wake up to headlines about saucers over Washington and fighters chasing them through the dark. An investigation could move slowly in quiet rooms on its own schedule. A frightened public could not. The country would want to be told something, and soon, and it would want to be told that everything was under control. That answer would come from a single large room, and from a single man standing in front of the press, asked to calm an entire nation in a single afternoon. By Monday morning, July 28, 1952, the story no longer belonged to the men in the tower. It belonged to the whole country. The newspapers had seized it, and they did not hold back. Headlines across the nation told readers that saucers had swarmed over the Capitol, that jets had been scrambled to chase them, that something strange had visited the skies above the seat of American power, not once, but on 2 weekends running, for a public already uneasy in the early Cold War. It was an unsettling thing to read over breakfast. The Capitol, the safest and most defended city in the country, had spent its nights watching unknown objects it could not catch. A story like that cannot simply be left to grow. Someone in authority had to stand up and speak for the government. That task fell to a man named Major General John Samford. Samford was the Director of Intelligence for the United States Air Force. He was not a fringe figure, or a junior press officer reading a prepared line. He was a senior intelligence officer near the top of the chain, exactly the kind of authority the public was inclined to believe, and he agreed to do something that, by the standards of the time, was remarkable. He would hold a press conference at the Pentagon and answer the country's questions about the lights over Washington. The room was packed. By the account that has come down to us, it was the largest press conference the Pentagon had held since the Second World War. That detail alone tells you how seriously the moment was taken. This was not a quiet briefing, tucked away on a slow afternoon. It was a major public event called to steady a nervous nation, and Sanford handled it with care. He did not mock the witnesses. He did not call them fools or liars. In fact, he said something that has been quoted ever since, a phrase that managed to honor the witnesses and calm the public at the same time. The reports he allowed had come from credible observers of relatively incredible things. It was a careful line. It granted that serious, trustworthy people had truly seen something they could not explain, while stopping well short of saying what that something was. Then he offered the explanation, the same one we have already met: temperature inversion. The warm over cool, layering in the summer air that could bend a radar beam and throw false returns onto a screen. Sanford leaned on it as the answer most acceptable to the public and the press, the explanation that was scientific, calming, and reassuringly ordinary. No enemy aircraft, no invaders, only the weather playing tricks on the instruments. And the press took it. They carried the explanation out of that room and printed it across the country. And as they repeated it, the story began to simplify. The radar had been fooled. The witnesses had been confused. The weather had done all of it. What had been a tangle of contacts, sightings, and failed chases collapsed in the public mind into a single, tidy sentence. It was only an inversion. You can measure the effect. In the period around the Washington flap, sightings were being reported at a rate of more than 50 a day. After Sanford's press conference, that number reportedly fell to about 10 a day. The explanation did not just answer the question, it drained the fear out of the air. The panic ended, and that, in itself, is worth pausing on because it cuts both ways. On one reading, this is the system working exactly as it should. The public was frightened. The fear was spreading. A senior, credible officer stood up, offered a reasonable, scientific explanation, and the country calmed down. There's nothing sinister in that. Sometimes an honest official with a plausible answer is simply doing his job, and the answer happens to be right. But there is a harder reading too, and it does not require accusing anyone of lying. Notice the timing. While Sanford was calming the nation from that Pentagon stage, Edward Ruppelt's own investigation, the official inquiry meant to actually solve the case, was still incomplete. The man whose job was to study these reports had been kept from the witnesses by closed runways and denied taxi fares. The case had not been fully worked, and yet the public answer had already been delivered, polished, and accepted. That is the quiet problem at the heart of this part of the story. A public answer and a solved case are not the same thing. An explanation can end the panic without ever closing the file. It can be true, or partly true, or simply convenient. And from the outside, all three look identical, because in each case the headlines fade and the public moves on. The calm that followed the press conference was real. Whether the explanation underneath it was the whole truth is a separate question. And that question was never fully settled. So by the end of July 1952, the Washington case had reached a strange resting place. On the surface, it was closed. The official word was inversion. The press had moved on, and the reports were thinning by the day. Underneath, the men who had watched the screens still did not believe the weather had fooled them, and the investigator who should have solved it had barely been allowed to begin. There is one more thing to understand before going further, something radar science alone can never explain. The Washington lights did not appear in a vacuum. They arrived in a particular country, in a particular year, into minds already primed by a decade of strange skies, atomic fear, and stories of visitors from beyond. To understand why those lights landed the way they did, and why a nation was so ready to be terrified, and then so quickly soothed, we have to step back from the radar screens entirely, and look at the world that was watching them. The lights over Washington did not fall into an empty sky. They did not fall into an empty mind either. By the summer of 1952, the idea of strange things moving overhead was not new or shocking on its own. It already had a history, a short but vivid one, and that history shaped exactly how people heard the news from the Capitol. To see why, we have to go back a little. During the Second World War, pilots flying combat missions over Europe and the Pacific began reporting odd things in the air around their aircraft, glowing balls of light, small, luminous shapes that seemed to pace the planes, keeping formation, then darting away. The airmen gave them a name: Foo Fighters. No one was ever quite sure what they were. Many pilots wondered uneasily whether they were some secret enemy weapon, a new German or Japanese device meant to track or disrupt them. The objects never attacked. They simply appeared, kept company with the bombers for a while, and vanished. And the war ended without anyone ever explaining them. Closer to home, there was the night of February 25th, 1942, in the skies over Los Angeles. Only months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a nervous city believed it was under air attack. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire into the darkness, throwing thousands of rounds at something in the sky above the coast. Searchlights swept back and forth across the night. The barrage went on, and when morning came, there was no enemy aircraft to be found, no wreckage. That settled the matter. What the gunners had been firing at was never clearly identified. The event passed into memory as a strange, frightening night. The official record could not fully close. People later called it the Battle of Los Angeles. Then came the moment that gave the whole subject its modern shape. In June of 1947, a pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying near Mount Rainier in Washington state when he saw a line of objects moving at tremendous speed across the sky. Reaching for a way to describe how they moved, he said they skipped along the way a saucer would if you sent it skimming across water. A reporter took that image and ran with it, and almost overnight, the phrase flying saucer entered the language. From that point on, the country had a word and a picture for the things people saw in the sky. That same year, 1947, brought another name that would echo for decades: Roswell. A strange recovery in the New Mexico desert briefly made headlines. Before the official explanation arrived, it had only been a weather balloon, the public was told, and the story slipped quietly out of the headlines and out of most people's attention. For the moment, it was closed. It would not stay that way forever. But in 1947, the weather balloon answer was enough to move it aside. The strangeness was not only in the news, it was also on the screen. Hollywood had begun to feed the public imagination with stories of visitors from space. In 1951, just a year before Washington, audiences watched the day the Earth stood still, in which a being from another world lands in the very heart of the American capital, carrying a warning for humanity. The film was thoughtful, even gentle, but its central image was unforgettable. A craft from the stars, settling down in Washington itself. When real lights appeared over the real capital 1 year later, that image was already waiting in people's minds, and beneath all of it ran the deepest current of the age, fear. The early 1950s were prosperous years for many Americans, years of new homes, new cars, and rising hope, but that comfort sat on top of a cold dread that never fully went away. The atomic bomb existed now, and the Soviet Union had one too. Every adult understood, in a quiet and constant way, that cities could be erased in minutes, that a war might begin with little warning, and that the sky itself was now a place from which danger could fall. The heavens were no longer just weather and birds and stars. They had become the direction the end might come from. Put all of this together, and you can see why the Washington lights struck so hard. To a person reading those headlines in 1952, the strange objects over the Capitol could mean almost anything, and each meaning carried its own kind of fear or wonder. They might be visitors from another world, the saucers Arnold had named and Hollywood had pictured. They might be Soviet weapons, a terrifying new aircraft testing the heart of America. They might be secret machines of the country's own making, devices its own people were not allowed to know about, or they might be nothing more than warm air and bending radar beams, a trick of the atmosphere dressed up as a threat. That is what made this case so powerful and so hard to put down. It was not only an event in the sky, it was a mirror. Every fear and every hope of that anxious year, the alien, the enemy, the secret, the simple mistake, could all be read into the same lights, over the same city. In the same July dark, the Washington flap became a place where the whole mood of an era gathered and looked up. And once an event carries that much meaning, the public's response to the official answer becomes a story of its own. Why was a single explanation offered quickly, accepted so completely by so many? The answer to that has less to do with radar, and far more to do with something the country still possessed in 1952, and would slowly begin to lose in the decades that followed: trust. In 1952, most Americans trusted their government. That single fact explains a great deal about how the Washington case ended. It is easy, from where we stand now, to forget how different that trust was. The country had just come through the Second World War as a victor. The institutions that had won that war, the military, the government, the men in uniform, carried enormous credit with the public. When a senior officer stood up and offered an explanation, especially on a matter of defense, the natural response of most people was to believe him, not out of foolishness, but out of a shared sense that these were serious men doing serious work, and that they would not lie to the people they served. In such a climate, an official answer did not have to fight for acceptance. It was met halfway. The country had already seen this happen just 5 years earlier with Roswell. A startling story broke. The public's attention turned, and then the weather balloon explanation arrived and quietly carried the whole thing away. Most people accepted it and moved on. The pattern was clear. A dramatic report, a calm official correction, and a public ready to be reassured. By the time the lights appeared over Washington, that pattern was almost a reflex. Now, It is important to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of ground where a story like ours can slip into accusation. The fact that official answers closed cases quickly does not prove that anyone was lying about Washington. It does not mean the temperature inversion explanation was a deliberate cover story. It only means that in 1952, the machinery for ending a public mystery worked smoothly because the public wanted it to work. But it helps to separate a few things that often get blurred together. There's a lie, which is a deliberate falsehood told to deceive. There is a cover story, which hides a real truth behind a false but believable one, usually to protect something the public is not meant to see. And there is a third thing, gentler and far more common, a hurried explanation, offered in good faith before all the facts are in, simply to calm a frightened room. These are not the same, and from the outside, in the moment, they can look identical. A confident, official, a reasonable answer, a public that relaxes. The Washington explanation could have been any of the three, and the people hearing it had no way to tell which. What complicates the picture is that cover stories were real. During the Cold War, the government genuinely did hide things, and often for understandable reasons. New aircraft were being tested in secret. Intelligence operations needed to stay invisible. When a classified project risked exposure, a cover story was sometimes the tool used to push public curiosity away. None of this proves anything about the lights over Washington. But it does mean that suspicion in later years was not pure paranoia. The public eventually learned that official answers were not always the whole story, and that knowledge changed how people look back at cases like this one. That shift took time. It did not really harden until the late 1970s and around 1980, when a new wave of doubt swept through the culture. Roswell, long buried under its weather balloon, came roaring back into public view. In 1980, a book called The Roswell Incident by Charles Berlitz and William Moore helped turn that old desert story into the foundation of a modern cover-up culture. From that point on, a great many people approached every official UFO explanation with their guard up, certain that somewhere behind it lay a hidden truth. And this is what makes the Washington case so strange to look at across time. It sits on a fault line between two different Americas. On one side, the country of 1952, still trusting, still inclined to take a general at his word, still relieved to be told that the weather had simply fooled the radar. On the other side, the country that would come later, schooled by decades of revealed secrets, ready to assume the opposite, that a calm official answer was probably hiding something. The very same press conference reads as honest reassurance to one era and as a possible whitewash to the next. And both eras are looking at the exact same words, which brings us to an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the temperature inversion explanation worked in 1952, not because it was airtight, but because the moment needed it to work. The public wanted to be calmed. The government wanted the panic gone. The press wanted a clean ending. An explanation arrived that gave everyone what they wanted, and so it was accepted, and the case was closed, regardless of whether it had truly answered the question. That is a thought about people, not about physics, and it leaves the most important question of all still standing, untouched by trust or doubt or the mood of an era. Set aside what the public wanted to believe. Set aside what officials wanted to say. Look only at the evidence itself, the screens, the sightings, the readings. Was the weather explanation actually strong enough to carry the weight that was placed on it? That is a question for the science, and the science deserves its own careful look. Let us begin by giving the skeptical view everything it is owed. Radar can be fooled. A bright shape on a screen is not the same thing as a solid craft in the sky. Any honest look at the Washington case has to start from that plain fact and hold on to it the whole way through. And we have already met one way the air can trick a radar: the temperature inversion. In the simplest terms, warm air sitting on cool air forms a kind of invisible boundary, and a radar beam crossing that boundary can bend, dip toward the ground, and send back something that was never really up in the sky. But inversions are not the only trick the atmosphere has. Patches of turbulent, churning air can scatter a radar signal and throw back faint, ghostly returns. There is even an effect, known by the name Bragg scattering, where the radar bounces off the layered structure of the air itself, painting the screen with shapes that have no solid object behind them at all. The point is simple. The sky is full of ways to lie to a radar, and an experienced investigator knows it. The skeptics can press the point further, and at their best, they press it well. Think about that strange vanishing pattern, the way the contacts faded whenever the jets arrived. If the returns were caused by delicate layers of air, then perhaps the jets themselves disturbed those layers as they roared through, and breaking up the very conditions that produce the false echoes. The objects did not flee the fighters. They simply dissolved because the fighters stirred the air that had been creating them. It is a clever argument. It takes the most haunting detail of the whole case and offers a calm physical reason for it. So the weather explanation is not weak, it is genuinely strong. And yet, when you keep looking, the difficulties start to gather, begin with where the contacts appeared. They were not seen on one screen, in one building, where a single quirk of equipment or air might be blamed. The anomalies were reportedly tracked from more than one radar location, including military sites in the area, and according to the account that has come down to us, similar effects were even noticed by analysts at the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, in Langley, Virginia. We should hold that last detail lightly, as a claim carried within the source, rather than a fully documented fact. But the broader pattern matters. When several separate stations, in different places, all show something in roughly the same part of the sky, a simple local glitch becomes a much harder thing to argue. Then there are the men reading the screens. This is the detail the weather explanation keeps tripping over. The operators tracking these contacts were not novices seeing their first night of strange returns. Reading a radar scope was their daily work. They knew what ground clutter looked like. They knew what weather looked like. They had watched inversions throw false echoes before and learned to recognize them. These were the very people most equipped to say calmly, "Oh, that is only the air again." And they did not say it. They looked at these contacts with all their training and judged them unusual. The explanation asks us to believe the experts were fooled by the one trick they had been trained to catch. Now turn from the screens to the sky, and to the people who looked up into it. Pilots and tower controllers are not random witnesses. A trained pilot spends his working life judging motion, distance, height, and speed. It is the core of staying alive in the air. When a man like that watches a light and says it moved in a way no aircraft could, his word carries weight that a startled bystander does not. There is something else worth knowing about pilots, something that cuts against the easy assumption that they exaggerate. In truth, many pilots had strong reasons to stay quiet. To report a strange sighting was to risk ridicule, and worse, to risk being seen as unreliable, even pulled from flying duty for a medical check. Far from rushing to claim a UFO, a great many pilots simply kept silent, unwilling to gamble their careers on a story no one would believe. So, when pilots did report something, it usually meant the event had been striking enough to overcome that fear. The stigma did not inflate the reports, it filtered them. And this brings us to the single most important idea in the whole case: the difference between a radar-only sighting, a visual-only sighting, and a radar-visual sighting. A radar return by itself can be a ghost in the machine. A light in the sky by itself can be a misjudged planet or a trick of tired eyes. Either one, alone, is easy to set aside. But when the radar shows a contact in a certain place, and a trained observer looks toward that exact place and sees something there too, the two weak threads twist together into something far stronger. The machine and the eye agreeing are much harder to dismiss than either one on its own. And the Washington case on both weekends was exactly this: radar and eyes together, pointing at the same patch of sky. Something was there, but what? That is the honest position, and it is worth stating plainly, because it satisfies no one fully. The radar visual link does not prove a craft from another world. It proves nothing about origins at all. What it does is close off the easy exits. It makes the pure weather explanation strain. It makes the pure imagination explanation strain. It leaves the case standing in the hardest, most uncomfortable place there is. Not proof of anything extraordinary, but not comfortably solved either. A real event, witnessed by capable people and recorded on serious equipment, that still refuses to settle into any tidy box. And once you reach that place, once you accept that something may genuinely have moved in the sky over Washington, the question stops being whether anything was there and becomes a harder one. What kind of something? Before reaching for the stars, an honest investigator has to look closer to home first, at the workshops and runways and secret programs of the human world. If the weather does not explain everything over Washington, then the next honest place to look is not the stars. It is the ground, and before anyone reaches for visitors from another world, a careful investigator has to ask a far more down-to-earth question. Could these have been machines built by human hands? It is not a foolish question. The early 1950s were one of the most explosive periods of aircraft development in history. The jet age was young and racing forward. Great companies, Boeing, Lockheed, Convair, Northrop, were pouring brilliance and money into new designs, some of them strange, some of them secret, all of them pushing the edge of what could fly. The sky over America in 1952 was a laboratory. New shapes were being tested. New speeds were being chased. And much of that work was hidden from the public. Exactly as you would expect in the middle of a Cold War. Some of those experimental shapes really could be mistaken for something otherworldly. Consider the flying wing. A design Northrop had explored. An aircraft with no clear body and no obvious tail, just a smooth, curved blade of a wing, seen in poor light at a distance or at an odd angle. A craft like that does not read as a normal plane. It reads as something wrong, something that should not be up there. It is easy to see how an unusual aircraft, glimpsed under strange conditions, could become a flying saucer in the telling. So the man-made explanation has real teeth, but it runs into the same wall the weather explanation did. the behavior. Whatever moved over Washington did not move like the aircraft of its day. And here, the numbers from the source are worth handling with care because they are striking, and striking numbers are easy to abuse. According to the account, the radar tracked objects making sudden bursts of speed, some reaching as high as 2,200 kilometers per hour. And on at least one occasion, a track was recorded at something close to 11,000 kilometers per hour, a figure so extreme it strains belief. Was now, the honest caution has to come immediately. Radar error remains entirely possible, and the higher a recorded speed climbs, the more likely it is that the instrument, not the object, produced it. We should not build a monument on a single wild track, but even setting that figure aside, the more modest bursts already outran the operational aircraft of 1952. No fighter in service on either side of the Cold War routinely behaved the way these contacts behaved, stopping, holding, accelerating, then slipping away from a pursuing jet. That difficulty pushes the question outward toward the enemy. This was the Cold War, and the most frightening man-made answer was not American at all. What if these were Soviet aircraft, some new machine, probing the defenses of the capital, testing how fast and how well America would respond? For the officers in those rooms, this was not a fantasy. It was the nightmare they were paid to watch for. An unknown craft over Washington could be the opening move of something far worse. The fear had a face. Around this period, the Soviet Union was developing long-range bombers, including the aircraft the world would come to know as the Tu-95, a heavy bomber built to reach distant targets. It is important to be precise here. The Tu-95 is not an explanation for the Washington lights, and nothing suggests it was over the Capitol that July, but it stands for the larger dread of the moment, the knowledge that the Soviets were building machines designed to fly far and strike hard, and that an unidentified contact over Washington might be a glimpse of exactly that kind of threat. There's a third man-made possibility, quieter than an enemy attack, but unsettling in its own way. A test, not of a craft, but of the defenses themselves. Imagine the military, or some part of the intelligence world, wanting to know how quickly radar operators and commanders would notice unknown targets over the capital, and how fast they could mount a response. The events of those 2 weekends would have been a perfect, brutal exam. And if that were the case, the slow scrambles, the closed runway at Andrews, the confusion in the chain of command, all of it would have been a failing grade, written across the sky for the press to see. That idea leads to an uncomfortable thought. If the Washington flap had exposed how poorly the Capitol's air defenses actually performed against unknown intruders, that is precisely the sort of thing officials would not want explained in public. A calm story about temperature inversions does not only soothe a frightened nation, it can also quietly bury an embarrassing truth about readiness. There is no proof this is what happened, but it shows how a man-made explanation could carry its own reasons for secrecy, with no aliens required at all. And then, at the far edge of these earthly theories sits the strangest one of all. Some have suggested that whatever flew over Washington was indeed built by no nation on Earth, but flown by human pilots that recovered technology from Roswell 5 years earlier, had somehow been studied and put into the air by 1952. It is a dramatic idea, and it deserves a clear and honest answer. The source offers no proof of it whatsoever. It is speculation stacked upon speculation. A story that requires accepting the most contested claim in all of UFO lore just to reach its starting line. We mention it only because it exists in the conversation, not because the evidence supports it. So where do the man-made explanations leave us? They do real work. Together, they reduce the need to reach for aliens. And they remind us that human technology, human secrecy, and human fear can account for a great deal. A secret prototype, a Soviet probe, a defense test gone wrong. Any of these is more likely on its face than a craft from another star. And yet, each one leaves a gap. The known aircraft of 1952 do not comfortably match the speeds and the motion. The Soviet threat fits the fear, but not the performance. The defense test explains the secrecy, but not the sightings themselves. At every turn, the human explanations shrink the mystery, but they do not quite close it. They take the aliens out of the room, and still, something is left standing in the corner that none of them fully accounts for, which means the question most people have wanted to ask all along, the one that has hovered over this entire story without being spoken plainly, can no longer be set aside. If it was not the weather, and not our machines, and not theirs, then what is left to consider? It is time to look up past the clouds, past the runways, and ask the oldest question there is. Aliens are not the first explanation a careful person should reach for. If anything, they belong near the last, after the weather, after the machines, after every ordinary answer has been tried and found wanting. And yet the Washington case has a way of walking a thoughtful person right up to that final door, not by proving anything, but simply by refusing every other explanation a clean fit. So we will open the door, look through it honestly, and stay just as careful here as everywhere else. Start with the question, underneath the question. Is it even reasonable to think life exists beyond Earth? On the scale of the universe, the answer is not as wild as it once sounded. Our galaxy alone holds hundreds of billions of stars, and beyond it lie billions of other galaxies. In recent decades, astronomers have confirmed that planets orbit other stars by the thousands, worlds of every size, some of them in the gentle zone where liquid water and perhaps life could exist. Faced with numbers that large, many serious people conclude that life of some kind somewhere is not just possible, but likely. That much is respectable science. The trouble is not whether life exists out there. The trouble is the distance. Consider the nearest promising star system to our own, Proxima Centauri. In the language of astronomy, it lies about 4.28 light years away. That sounds almost cozy until you translate it. According to the source, that distance is around 40 trillion kilometers. The number is so large, it stops meaning anything at all. To make it real, think of our fastest spacecraft. The Voyager 1 probe, launched decades ago and still racing outward into the dark, has crossed only the tiniest sliver of the distance to even that closest star. At its speed, the journey would take tens of thousands of years, the nearest neighbor we have, and it is effectively unreachable. This is the hard wall every alien explanation slams into for something to have crossed that gulf and arrived in our skies. It would need to do things our physics cannot yet do, and perhaps can never do. It would require bending the very rules we believe hold the universe together. It is here that the conversation reaches for its most exotic ideas, and it is here we must be most careful, and of all, there are concepts discussed in serious circles, and even in government-linked studies of advanced aerospace, that imagine ways around the wall, a program known by the name AIATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, is reported in the source to have explored ideas like these: anti-gravity, invisibility, wormholes that fold space, warp drives that move it, even theoretical gateways across distance. We should be plain about what these are. They are speculation, the outer frontier of physics and imagination, not proven tools sitting in anyone's hangar. To list them is not to claim they are real. It is only to show how far you have to travel from ordinary science before an interstellar visitor becomes possible. So, let us set the stars aside for a moment and come back down to that July, because the most grounded reason to keep the Washington case open has nothing to do with aliens at all. It is that Washington was not alone. That same summer carried other strange reports, clustered close in time. Around July 26th, the very weekend the lights returned to the Capitol, there was a separate F-94 chase reported over California. Days later, on July 29th, a radar case unfolded near Lake Huron, tracking something at a speed reported as over 600 miles per hour. Set these beside Washington and the picture shifts. The Capitol sightings stop looking like one local night of confusion, one city's bad luck with the weather. They begin to look like part of a larger wave, a whole summer in which trained people across the country kept seeing things they could not name. A single odd night and can be an accident. A season of them is a pattern, and patterns are what demand an explanation. But for all the talk of physics and distance and clusters, the truest center of this story was never in the sky. It was in the rooms. It was Ed Nugent, leaning toward his scope, watching 7 blips that should not have been there. It was Harry Barnes reaching for a joke to steady himself. It was a pilot named Pierman counting lights from his cockpit, and William Patterson pushing his fighter after something that would not let itself be caught, and a young captain named Ruppelt fighting paperwork just to reach the witnesses. The heart of the case is a handful of careful, capable people doing their jobs, suddenly faced with something that would not fit the world as they understood it, and trying with everything they had to give it a name, and failing. So what is the final, honest verdict? The truth is that there are several cases here, and each one has real strength. There is a case for radar confusion, for warm air bending beams over a summer city. There is a case for secret technology, ours or theirs, flown in the shadows of the Cold War. There is a case for misreadings, born of an anxious, frightened age. And there is a case, quieter and harder to dismiss than the skeptics would like, that something genuinely unknown moved over Washington on those 2 nights. The evidence does not crown a single winner. It leaves them all standing, none strong enough to defeat the others. And so, the right ending is not a conclusion. It is the absence of one. The Washington flap of 1952 was investigated, explained, and officially closed. The reports thinned. The press moved on. The word inversion settled over it like dust, but the men who were there never fully believed it. The science never fully confirmed it. And the case never truly resolved into anything a careful mind could call solved. The file stayed open in everything but name. What remains, after all the theories, is an image. A summer morning, over Washington, just after dawn. The radar screens clean and empty. The jets back on the ground, their engines cooling. The orange lights that had haunted 2 weekends, gone, as if they had never been there at all. The sky over the Capitol looking utterly, perfectly ordinary. And down below, in a quiet office, a thin stack of paper, a few reports and readings and witness statements. The only proof left that anything had happened at all. The lights had vanished. Only the files remained. There are mysteries that announce themselves with noise and spectacle, and then fade. The Washington case was never one of those. It sits quietly between fear and secrecy, between science and belief, never settling cleanly into any single box. Temperature inversion may explain some of what the radar showed on those warm July nights. It cannot explain the full weight of it, the trained witnesses, the strange timing, the lights seen with waking eyes, the jets sent up into an empty sky. Some mysteries endure not because they are loud, but because they are quiet, because they were closed and explained and filed away, and still, decades later, they refuse to disappear. So picture it one last time as you let the day go. Washington before dawn, the radar screens clearing, the jets back on the ground, the sky over the Capitol turning ordinary again, pale and silent, holding whatever it held that summer and saying nothing about it at all. Rest now. There is no need to solve it tonight. The files will keep. Remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss next story. New alien and UFO encounters are waiting for you here every day.